This channel is for women who are doing fine, but feel quietly lost. I need to start with something uncomfortable. There was a night I almost texted a man, "Do you even want me?" Not because I loved him, but because I needed to know if I had won. That is not a sentence I ever thought I would say out loud. I was sitting alone in my apartment in Brooklyn, the city humming below me like it always does. Taxis moving, sirens echoing, someone laughing on the sidewalk. And my kitchen light was the only one on. My phone was face down on the marble counter, but my body was tuned to it like a wire waiting for current. I had told my friends I really liked him. His name was Ethan. He was thoughtful, intelligent, successful in that understated way that makes a woman feel chosen just by proximity. We had gone out a handful of times, nothing dramatic, no declarations, just enough warmth to create hope. And then he went quiet, not gone, not cruel, just quiet. You know the kind of quiet I mean. The kind that stretches 2 hours into something existential. The kind that makes you replay your last sentence in your head. The kind that convinces you were too much, or not enough, or slightly misaligned in tone. That night, I wasn't thinking about love. I was thinking about whether I had been selected. I told myself I missed him. What I actually missed was certainty. My chest felt tight, like I was waiting for medical results. And my thoughts weren't romantic. They were strategic. Should I text? Should I wait? If I wait, does that increase my value? If I reach out, does that decrease it? That's not love. That's positioning. And the realization hit me so quietly, it almost felt cruel. I didn't want intimacy. I wanted confirmation. There's a difference, and most of us never pause long enough to see it. Love is about connection. Being picked is about validation. Love is mutual discovery. Being picked is a verdict. I wasn't aching because I missed him. I was aching because I didn't know if I had been chosen. And that uncertainty felt like a referendum on my worth. It shocks me now how easily a woman who has built a life, who pays her bills, runs meetings, shows up for her friends, navigates grief, raises children, survives divorce, can still shrink into that teenage posture of waiting, waiting to be wanted, waiting to be confirmed, waiting to feel enough. I used to say, calmly, "I'm looking for love." Sounded mature, self-aware, grounded. But if I am honest, what I was scanning for was this. Will you choose me in a way that makes me feel safe? If Ethan had texted that night and said, "I've been thinking about you. I want to see where this goes," my entire nervous system would have relaxed, not because I felt known, but because I would have felt validated. That's a different relief. It's sharper, more immediate, more addictive. And I started to notice something disturbing in myself. When a man was clearly interested, I felt neutral. When he was uncertain, distracted, or slightly out of reach, I felt activated, alive, magnetic, compelled. I told myself that was chemistry. But chemistry shouldn't feel like a performance review, and that's what it felt like, as if I was waiting for a hiring decision. Will I get the job of being wanted? That night in Brooklyn, I picked up my phone and opened our message thread. I read our last exchange again. I analyzed punctuation. I calculated response times. I tried to decode tone, and then I asked myself a question that changed everything. If he never texts again, what exactly have I lost? The answer wasn't companionship. It wasn't shared memories. It wasn't even potential. It was the possibility of being chosen. And that is when I felt the truth land. Maybe I don't want love. Maybe I want to be picked so I can finally feel worthy. And that's a hard sentence to sit with, especially when you are over 35, over 40, over 50. We tell ourselves we've evolved beyond that. We say we're independent. We say we don't need anyone to complete us. And I believe that. But independence does not erase the quiet hunger to be selected. There is something ancient in it, something adolescent, something that still remembers what it felt like to wait at a locker, or at a dance, or by a landline phone. And only now it's an iPhone on a marble counter in Brooklyn. And I am not a girl. I am a woman who has done everything right. So why does my worth still feel negotiable in the presence of male attention? That question is not dramatic. It's precise. Because if I strip away the poetry, what I was experiencing that night was not heartbreak. It was evaluation anxiety. I was waiting for someone else to decide how valuable I am. That is not love. That is outsourcing self-worth. And once I saw it, and I couldn't unsee it, I began to replay not just this situation, but years of them. The men who pulled away and made me lean forward. The ones who were emotionally unavailable and somehow more attractive because of it. The subtle competition I felt with women I'd never met. The way my mood could shift based on a single message. I thought I was chasing connection. I was chasing confirmation. And here's the part that feels almost brutal to admit. Being chosen felt more intoxicating than being understood. Because being understood requires vulnerability. Being chosen requires performance. And I had been performing for most of my life. If this is resonating with you, if you've ever felt that quiet tightening in your chest while waiting for someone to affirm you, then you're exactly where you're meant to be. Before we go deeper into this conversation, I want to ask you to subscribe to this channel, not for numbers, not for algorithms, but because these are the conversations most women have in whispers, alone at night, headphones in, pretending they're fine. If this space feels like somewhere you can exhale, stay. Subscribe. It helps this channel continue. It tells me I'm not speaking into a void, because what I'm about to unpack next is not about men. It's about the equation that made me believe being chosen meant being safe. And that equation didn't begin in Brooklyn. It began much earlier. The equation that made me believe being chosen meant being safe where worth first became conditional. If I trace this back honestly, it doesn't begin with Ethan in Brooklyn. It begins in a quiet beige house outside Phoenix, where the air smelled like dust after rain, and everything looked orderly from the outside. I was a capable child. That's what people said about me. Capable, mature, independent. No one ever called me difficult. No one ever described me as dramatic. I learned very early that my value increased in proportion to how little trouble I caused. My father, Robert, was a practical man. He believed in effort, achievement, discipline. When I brought home a report card with straight A's, he would nod with approval that felt like sunlight. When I won a small academic award, he shook my hand like I had secured something meaningful. But when I cried too long, when I felt confused, when I didn't know how to explain the ache in my chest after a fight with a friend, the response shifted. "You're strong," he would say. "You'll figure it out." It sounded empowering. It felt like dismissal. My mother, Linda, was overwhelmed in quieter ways. She loved me. I know that now. But she was stretched thin, emotionally and physically. I learned to read her moods the way other children learned multiplication tables. If she was tired, I became invisible. If she was anxious, I became helpful. If she was disappointed, I became better. No one sat me down and said, "Your worth depends on performance." No one needed to. The pattern taught me. I began to understand something subtle and powerful. Attention was earned. Safety was earned. Approval was earned. And love, though no one used that word directly, felt like something that arrived after I had proven myself. Children need three things in ways that are not negotiable. They need to feel safe, they need to feel seen, and they need to feel special. I felt safe when I followed the rules. I felt seen when I achieved something. I felt special when I made someone's life easier. But I did not feel those things simply because I existed. That distinction changes a nervous system. When safety is conditional, you learn to scan for cues constantly. You learn to anticipate reactions before they happen. You learn to shape-shift slightly, just enough to stay in favor. By the time I was 13, and I was already fluent in emotional calibration, I could sense when a teacher preferred certain students and adjust my tone accordingly. I could sense when a boy's attention was drifting and become more charming, more interesting, more accommodating. I don't remember deciding to do this. It felt instinctive. It felt smart. It felt necessary. In high school, when I was chosen for small things, a seat at a certain lunch table, on an invitation to a dance, I felt a surge of relief that had nothing to do with romance. It felt like confirmation that I had done it correctly, that I had positioned myself well, that I had remained desirable enough. That relief was not about connection. It was about survival. When worth becomes conditional in childhood, the body never quite stops trying to secure it. Even as an adult woman, financially independent, professionally respected, living in cities like San Francisco and New York, and that early equation hummed quietly underneath everything. To be chosen is to be safe. To be desired is to be valuable. To be wanted is to be worthy. It wasn't just about men. It showed up everywhere. In my career, I over-delivered. I volunteered for projects no one else wanted. I stayed late without being asked. When a supervisor praised me, I felt grounded. When feedback was neutral, I felt destabilized. In friendships, I was the reliable one, the listener, the planner, and the one who remembered birthdays and organized dinners. If someone pulled away, even slightly, I felt compelled to fix it. In my marriage, before the divorce, I prided myself on being low maintenance. I told myself I was easygoing. What I really was most of the time was careful. Careful not to demand too much. Careful not to disrupt the equilibrium. Because somewhere deep in my conditioning, disruption equaled risk, and risk equaled abandonment. When a child learns that love feels inconsistent or slightly out of reach, she adapts by becoming impressive. She becomes useful. She becomes pleasant. She becomes the least complicated version of herself. I became that version so seamlessly that I mistook it for my personality. I thought I was naturally independent, naturally strong, naturally undemanding. It took me decades to realize I was performing stability so that no one would withdraw approval. And here is the part that feels most sobering. When being chosen is linked to safety, rejection does not feel like disappointment. It feels like danger. That is why, years later, a delayed text from a man like Ethan could activate something so disproportionate. It wasn't about him. It was about the old wiring that said, if you are not selected, you are exposed. When I look back at that house in Phoenix, I don't see villains. I see two adults doing the best they could with what they knew. But children do not interpret nuance. They interpret patterns. And the pattern I absorbed was this. Love is steady when you are performing well. So I became high-performing in every area that might secure attachment. I excelled academically. I managed my emotions privately. I became the woman who had it together. But the cost of being the capable one is that no one thinks to ask if you are tired. No one assumes you need reassurance. No one questions whether your strength is armor. When worth first becomes conditional, it does not announce itself dramatically. It slips in quietly, shaping decisions, shaping relationships, shaping attraction. It teaches you to lean forward when someone pulls back. It teaches you to overfunction when someone underfunctions. It teaches you that if you can just become a little better, more desirable, more successful, more agreeable, you will secure what feels uncertain. And because that strategy once helped you survive emotionally, sure, your nervous system does not question it. It repeats it. That is how the equation followed me into adulthood without my consent. That is how I ended up confusing being chosen with being safe. Not because I was naive, not because I lacked intelligence, but because my body had learned long ago that attention equals protection. It has taken me years to understand that safety built on performance is fragile. It requires constant maintenance. It collapses under the smallest sign of disapproval, and it keeps me chasing selection instead of experiencing connection. The little girl in Phoenix did not know she was writing an equation. She was simply adapting. But the woman I am now has to decide whether that equation still deserves authority. Because if my worth was first made conditional there, then it makes sense that I keep trying to secure it everywhere else. And if I do not gently question that conditioning, I will keep looking to be picked, not because I want love, but because I am still trying to feel safe. When anxiety felt like chemistry, how my nervous system mistook chaos for love. When I moved to San Francisco in my late 30s, I told myself I was ready for something different. New city, new apartment, new restaurants, new routines. I didn't say it out loud, but I also meant new love. That was when I met Lucas. He had that quiet confidence that feels earned. He worked in tech, wore simplicity like a statement, and spoke in measured sentences that made me lean in slightly just to catch the nuance. Our first date was in North Beach, at a dimly lit wine bar where the tables were close enough to make everything feel intimate. He held eye contact just a second longer than necessary. He asked thoughtful questions. He listened in a way that felt attentive, but not overly eager. I left that night with a subtle rush in my body. Not peace, not warmth, rush. The second date was electric. The third was delayed. The fourth was canceled. He apologized, convincingly. His job was demanding. He had a lot going on. I understood. I prided myself on understanding. But what I remember most isn't his behavior. It's my body. When he texted, I felt a spike of relief that bordered on euphoria. When he didn't, my stomach tightened in a way I couldn't reason myself out of. I would replay our conversations while brushing my teeth, while standing in line for coffee, while staring at the ceiling at night. Then I called it chemistry, but chemistry shouldn't feel like uncertainty. What I felt with Lucas was activation. My nervous system was lit up, scanning, anticipating. Every interaction felt charged. Every small gesture carried disproportionate meaning. If he complimented me, it lingered in my bloodstream. If he was distant, it felt like withdrawal. It was intoxicating, and it was exhausting. I mistook intensity for depth. That's what I see now. The push and pull created contrast, and contrast creates sensation. When he pulled away slightly, I leaned forward. When he leaned in, I relaxed just enough to feel hopeful. It was a rhythm that felt strangely familiar, like a dance I had practiced before without remembering where I learned it. There were evenings when I would sit by my apartment window overlooking the city lights, phone in hand, telling myself not to check if he'd read my message. My mind knew better. It told me I deserved consistency. It reminded me I was a grown woman, not a teenager waiting by a locker. But my body didn't care about logic. It cared about familiarity. And familiarity felt like this, a little unpredictable, slightly out of reach, just enough attention to keep me invested. When I think about Lucas now, I don't think about him as a villain. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't manipulative. He was simply emotionally inconsistent. Sometimes warm, sometimes distracted, sometimes fully present, sometimes absent. And for someone whose nervous system was wired to equate inconsistency with love, that felt magnetic. I used to believe butterflies were proof. If my heart raced, if my palms felt slightly damp, if I felt that flutter in my chest when his name appeared on my screen, I assumed it meant something important. I didn't question why calm felt dull. I didn't question why steadiness felt flat. It's uncomfortable to admit this, but part of me felt most alive when I was trying to secure him. When I didn't know where I stood, I felt driven, focused, engaged. There is a specific kind of energy that comes from uncertainty. It sharpens attention. It narrows the world to one outcome. It creates a subtle competition in your own mind. Can I win this? I didn't frame it that way consciously. I told myself I was just invested. But underneath there was a quiet, proving dynamic unfolding. If Lucas, with all his options and distractions, chose me fully, it would validate something I couldn't articulate. It would mean I was compelling enough, important enough, different enough. The highs and lows of our dynamic created a kind of emotional volatility that felt passionate. When he planned a spontaneous weekend trip down the coast, I felt chosen. When he canceled dinner the following week because he needed space, I felt destabilized. I thought the oscillation meant depth. What it actually meant was that my nervous system was hooked, and there's something about intermittent reinforcement that is powerful. When attention is given inconsistently, it becomes more valuable. Each small moment of warmth feels amplified because it isn't guaranteed. I didn't see that I was responding less to him and more to the pattern. The unpredictability mirrored something older inside me. It mirrored the early lessons that love is not steady. It's something you maintain through vigilance. So when Lucas was unpredictable, I didn't retreat. I adapted. I became more interesting, more supportive, more flexible. I framed his distance as independence. I reframed my anxiety as passion. Friends would ask gently, "Does this feel good?" And I would say yes, because in moments it did. But feeling good in spikes is not the same as feeling secure. I remember one specific night. We had planned to meet in the Mission District. I arrived first. He was late. 10 minutes turned into 20. My body was rigid. I checked my phone. No message. And by the time he walked in, apologizing lightly, my relief was so intense, it almost felt like gratitude. Gratitude for basic presence. That should have told me something. Love should not feel like being grateful someone showed up. And yet I interpreted that relief as proof of connection, as if the anxiety beforehand validated the intensity afterward. When I reflect on that period, I see how deeply I confused chaos with closeness. And the emotional roller coaster created a narrative. If it feels this intense, it must be meaningful. But intensity can be the body's alarm system, not its compass. The more unpredictable he was, the more I tried to stabilize things. The more I tried to stabilize, the more invested I became. It created a feedback loop that kept me engaged long after clarity would have suggested stepping back. And here is the truth that unsettled me when I finally faced it. A part of me preferred this dynamic because it was familiar. It matched the internal rhythm I had known since childhood. Attention that comes and goes, warmth that must be maintained, connection that feels slightly out of reach. Consistency, on the other hand, felt foreign. Foreign can feel unsafe. So when a man is steady, when he texts reliably, when he communicates clearly, the nervous system that is used to chaos may not light up. It may not produce butterflies. It may not generate that sharp anticipation. It may simply feel calm, and calm to a body conditioned by unpredictability can register as boring. I wish I could say I recognized this immediately. I didn't. It took time, distance, and painful repetition to see that what I had labeled chemistry was often just anxiety wearing perfume. Lucas was not the problem. The problem was that my body equated emotional volatility with meaning. Until I understood that, I kept chasing the feeling of being activated, mistaking it for love. And as long as anxiety felt like chemistry, peace didn't stand a chance. The performance trap. I wasn't loving. I was auditioning. There's a moment I remember with unsettling clarity. I was in Lucas's apartment in San Francisco, standing in his kitchen, laughing at something he said. I had brought a bottle of wine I knew he liked, and I had chosen an outfit that looked effortless, but had taken 20 minutes of quiet deliberation. I had prepared stories in my mind, interesting, but not overwhelming, vulnerable, but not heavy. As I watched myself move through the evening, a strange awareness surfaced. I was not relating to him. I was presenting to him. It felt subtle at first, almost harmless. After all, everyone puts their best foot forward in the beginning. But this wasn't about being my best self. It was about being my most acceptable self. I monitored my tone. I softened my opinions. When he mentioned needing more independence in past relationships, I nodded, reassuring him that I valued space too. When he spoke about how much he admired women who were low drama, I smiled, silently proud that I qualified. I thought I was connecting. What I was actually doing was auditioning for the role of the woman who would finally be chosen. It's painful to admit how much of my identity in those moments was strategic, not manipulative in a conscious way, but curated, filtered, optimized. I became the woman who didn't ask for too much reassurance, the woman who didn't question ambiguity too quickly, the woman who could handle inconsistency without flinching. I told myself this was maturity. In truth, it was performance. When I think about it now, I realize I treated relationships like interviews. There was an invisible checklist in my mind. Am I interesting enough? Attractive enough? Easy enough? Am I creating just enough intrigue without appearing insecure? Am I demonstrating value without looking like I'm trying? The irony is that I believed I wanted intimacy. But intimacy requires exposure, and exposure risks disqualification. Performance, on the other hand, feels safer. If I can control the narrative, if I can anticipate what is desirable and embody it, and then I increase my chances of being selected. There is a specific fantasy that fueled this behavior, and it's not one we talk about openly. I wanted to be the woman who changed him. With Lucas, especially, there was an undercurrent of challenge. He had dated casually for years. He prided himself on not settling. Part of me felt drawn to that resistance. If he chose me, fully, decisively, it would mean I was different, exceptional, irreplaceable. There is something intoxicating about the idea of being the one who finally breaks through someone's walls. It feels like achievement disguised as romance. But that fantasy is rooted in competition, not connection. I wasn't asking, is he right for me? I was asking, am I good enough for him? That subtle shift in focus changes everything. When love becomes an audition, the stakes feel high. Every interaction is evaluated. Every silence is interpreted. Every small success, a compliment, an affectionate gesture, feels like passing around, and passing feels powerful. It feels like progress. But progress toward what? Toward being validated. I see now how much of my energy went into maintaining an image. I was the supportive partner, the understanding one, the woman who didn't burden him with her insecurities. If I felt anxious, I processed it alone. If I wanted clarity, I waited. If something hurt, I minimized it. I confused self-sufficiency with emotional suppression. And because I had spent so much of my life being capable, being the woman who handles things, I carried that same posture into dating. I prided myself on not needing too much. I wore independence like armor. But armor, no matter how polished, is still armor. It protects, but it also prevents closeness. What unsettles me most is how natural this felt. I didn't wake up and decide to perform. It was reflexive. I read his cues and adjusted. I sensed his hesitations and compensated. If he pulled back slightly, I became more magnetic. If he leaned in, I rewarded him with warmth. It was choreography, and I was very good at it. The cost of being good at it was that I rarely asked myself whether I felt safe enough to stop. When relationships are built on performance, there is no rest. There is only maintenance. You have to keep being impressive, keep being interesting, keep being desirable. Because if the relationship was secured by your exceptionalism, and then you must remain exceptional to keep it, that's exhausting. And yet, there was something about it that felt familiar. I had been performing competence for decades, performing strength, performing ease. Why would I not perform desirability too? I realize now that performance gave me a sense of control. If I wasn't chosen, I could blame my strategy. I could tweak it, improve it, try harder next time. If I stopped performing and still wasn't chosen, then what? And then the rejection would feel personal, final. Performance allows distance from that kind of vulnerability. There was another layer beneath it all that took me longer to see. I didn't just want to be loved. I wanted to be the best, the one he couldn't ignore, the one he compared others to, the one who stood out in a crowd of women. It's uncomfortable to say that, especially as a woman in her 40s who prides herself on depth and emotional intelligence. But the competitive undercurrent was real. Being chosen by a man like Lucas felt like proof of superiority. Not just worth, but status. And that reveals something deeper than romance. It reveals how tightly my identity was wrapped around external validation. I wasn't loving. I was proving. I was trying to prove that I could be calm enough, attractive enough, undemanding enough to win. But love isn't something you win. It's something you experience. And you cannot experience it fully while you are performing. There is a quiet tragedy in realizing how much of your relational life has been an audition, not because you were fake, but because you were afraid that your unfiltered needs would be inconvenient, afraid that your ordinary moods would be unattractive, afraid that if you stopped optimizing, someone would look elsewhere. So you optimize, you refine, you present, and in doing so, you slowly disappear. When I look back at those evenings in San Francisco, at the careful way I curated myself around Lucas, I don't feel shame as much as I feel tenderness. I see a woman who believed her value had to be demonstrated repeatedly, a woman who believed being loved required continuous qualification. And as long as I believed that, I would keep auditioning for roles instead of participating in relationships. I thought I was seeking connection. In truth, I was seeking confirmation that I was exceptional enough to be kept. That is not love. That is performance dressed up as romance, and it took me far too long to realize the difference. Even when he chose me, I still felt uncertain why validation never sticks. After San Francisco, after the volatility with Lucas finally burned itself out, I told myself I was done with uncertainty. I was tired of decoding text messages, tired of measuring my worth against someone's inconsistency, tired of that subtle, humiliating relief when a man simply showed up. When I met Mark in Seattle, everything looked different from the start. He was steady in a way that almost felt understated. We met through mutual friends at a small dinner party in Ballard. He asked for my number directly. He followed up the next day. He suggested a specific plan for the weekend instead of floating vague possibilities. There was no guessing, no strategic delay, no emotional chess. On our third date, he said, tone calmly, "I'm not interested in playing games. If this feels good to you, I'd like to keep building it." I remember nodding, almost surprised by the clarity. He chose me, not ambiguously, not halfway, clearly, and something inside me did not relax the way I thought it would. This is the part no one talks about. We assume that if the right person chooses us, the anxiety dissolves. We imagine that certainty will feel like peace. But when Mark's consistency met my old wiring, something unexpected happened. I began to doubt it. Not him. It. The ease. The steadiness. He called when he said he would. He introduced me to his friends without hesitation. He spoke about future plans with a grounded tone that didn't feel performative. There were no dramatic highs and lows. And without those spikes, I didn't know how to measure the intensity of my feelings. I found myself asking quiet questions in the dark. Is this enough? Why doesn't this feel electric? Why do I feel slightly restless instead of overwhelmed? I had spent so long equating anxiety with chemistry that calm felt suspicious. With Lucas, the tension created constant movement. With Mark, there was space. And space can feel exposing when you're used to performing. Because when no one is pulling away, you can't prove yourself by chasing. When no one is withholding affection, you can't win it. When someone simply chooses you, consistently, the performance has nowhere to hide. And that is where the real discomfort began. Mark would look at me across a quiet dinner and say, "I really admire how thoughtful you are." Instead of absorbing it, I would scan for subtext. Does he mean that? Is he just being polite? Will he still feel this way in a month? Validation landed, but it didn't settle. It skimmed the surface and evaporated. I began to notice something unsettling about myself. The more steady he was, the more my mind searched for cracks. If he was late once, and even by accident, my nervous system flared slightly. If his tone shifted after a long day at work, I wondered if something had changed between us. I wasn't responding to his behavior. I was responding to my history. The wound that believes worth is conditional does not retire simply because someone treats you well. It waits. It watches. It anticipates loss. And so even when Mark chose me, explicitly, consistently, generously, I struggled to feel chosen internally. That is a lonely realization, one to sit across from a good man and realize the instability you feel isn't coming from him. It's coming from you. There were moments when I almost missed the chaos, not because I wanted to be hurt, but because chaos gave me a role. In uncertainty, I knew who to be. Impressive, strategic, magnetic. In stability, I had to be real, and being real meant revealing parts of myself that weren't polished. One evening in Seattle, we were sitting on his couch, rain tapping softly against the windows, and he reached for my hand and said, "You don't have to have it together all the time with me." I laughed reflexively, but something in my chest tightened. Because if I didn't have to have it together, then who was I here? If I wasn't performing strength, what would I show instead? I realized then that I had tied my identity so tightly to being desirable and competent that being loved simply for existing felt foreign. Foreign does not automatically feel safe. There is a quiet grief in recognizing that even when you are given what you say you want, it doesn't land the way you imagined. I had told myself for years that if a man chose me fully, I would feel secure. Mark chose me, and I still felt uncertain. That uncertainty forced a harder question. If validation doesn't stick, then what am I actually missing? The answer was not more reassurance. He reassured me naturally. It was not more proof. His actions were consistent. And what I was missing was internal stability. If worth is outsourced, no amount of external choosing can make it permanent. It becomes a drip-feed system. You need regular confirmation to maintain equilibrium. And the moment confirmation pauses, even briefly, the old fear resurfaces. I saw how dangerous that dynamic could become. If I depended on Mark to regulate my sense of value, then his human fluctuations, his bad moods, his work stress, his natural need for space would feel like threats. One, not because he was withdrawing love, but because I was using his presence to measure my worth. There were days when he would say something kind and I would feel warmth, and then, hours later, I would question whether I had imagined it, whether I deserved it, whether it would last. It felt like trying to fill a glass with a crack in the bottom. No matter how much he poured in, it never stayed full, and that is not a criticism of him. It is an acknowledgement of the wound. The wound began long before Mark. It began when worth became conditional. So when he chose me, I experienced something almost disorienting, not the high of victory, not the rush of conquest, but the quiet confrontation of my own internal instability. Because if someone good chooses you and you still feel unsure, you can no longer blame the wrong man. You have to look inward. That was the beginning of a different kind of reckoning, not about how to get chosen, but about why being chosen had never been enough. The fear beneath the performance. What if I'm not impressive and no one stays? The most frightening question I have ever asked myself was not, why doesn't he choose me? It was this, if I stop being impressive, will anyone stay? That question didn't surface in a dramatic moment. It didn't arrive during a breakup or an argument. It came quietly, one evening in Seattle, after Mark had fallen asleep beside me. The room was dark. The city outside was hushed by rain. His breathing was steady, uncomplicated. And I was awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling something I couldn't name at first. It wasn't anxiety about him leaving. It was anxiety about being seen without armor. For most of my life, I have been the competent one, the woman who handles things, the woman who anticipates problems before they happen, the woman who remains composed during conflict, even after my divorce, and when the structure of my marriage collapsed and the identity I had built around being a wife dissolved, I maintained that posture. Friends told me how strong I was, how gracefully I navigated it, how admirable my resilience seemed. I accepted those compliments like currency. Strength became my brand, but strength, when it becomes a brand, can become a cage. Because if I am always the strong one, where do my softer edges go? Where does confusion go? Where does loneliness go when the children leave home and the house feels too large, too quiet? After my divorce, when the last of the moving boxes were cleared and the legal papers signed, I remember standing alone in my kitchen. There was no chaos anymore, no arguments, no tension, just space. And in that space, I didn't feel liberated. I felt invisible. I had built so much of my identity around being needed, managing schedules, smoothing conflicts, holding things together. When that role ended, I was left with something far more unsettling than heartbreak. I was left with myself. Without the structure of marriage, Without the daily proof that someone required my presence, I had to confront a question I had avoided for years. Who am I if I am not indispensable? That question followed me into dating. With Lucas, I performed in order to be chosen. With Mark, I found myself afraid to stop performing entirely. Because if I stopped being impressive, what would be left? The truth beneath all of it was not about men. It was about exposure. Impressiveness creates distance. It allows admiration without vulnerability. When someone admires you for your competence, your beauty, your composure, they are responding to something curated. But when someone sees your insecurity, your doubt, your tiredness, your unfiltered emotion, that is different. That is risk. There was a moment with Mark that unsettled me more than any conflict ever could. I had had a difficult week at work. A project I led was criticized publicly in a meeting. It wasn't catastrophic, but it stung. I felt embarrassed, questioned, small. I came home quieter than usual. He noticed immediately. "What's going on?" he asked gently. I started to answer with a polished version of the story, the efficient summary, the emotionally contained account. But something inside me paused. I realized I was about to perform resilience again. Instead, I let the sentence falter, and I told him I felt humiliated, that I doubted myself, that I was tired of always needing to be competent. As I spoke, I felt exposed in a way that was almost physical. I waited for the shift, the subtle withdrawal, the loss of admiration. It didn't come. He listened. He stayed. He didn't fix me. He didn't minimize it. He didn't pull away. That should have been comforting. Instead, it was disorienting, because the script I had memorized for decades suggested that vulnerability reduces value. If I am impressive, I am desirable. If I am steady, I am safe to love. If I am easy, I am worth keeping. But what if I am messy? What if I am insecure? What if I am ordinary on a random Tuesday evening, without sparkle or wit or strength? That is the fear beneath the performance. Not rejection in its dramatic form, but quiet abandonment in response to authenticity. As I moved through my late 40s and into my 50s, another layer began to surface, one that many women do not name out loud. Aging changes the landscape of desirability. The cultural messages are relentless. Youth is celebrated. Newness is valued. Visibility feels thinner with each passing year. Even when I intellectually reject those messages, they seep into the body. There were mornings when I looked in the mirror and wondered whether I was still exceptional enough to be chosen. That word again. Exceptional. Why did love require exceptionality? Why wasn't being human sufficient? The older I get, and the more I see how deeply I tied my lovability to performance. Performance in my career, performance in my marriage, performance in dating, even performance in healing, being the self-aware, emotionally evolved woman. It is exhausting to live as a constant resume, and yet without it, I felt strangely untethered. If I stop showcasing my strengths, will someone discover my limitations and leave? If I stop being the stable one, will I be too heavy? If I reveal my loneliness on an empty Sunday afternoon, will it make me less attractive? These questions are not dramatic. They are quiet. They surface at night. They whisper in moments of silence, and they reveal the core wound more clearly than any breakup ever could. I was never truly afraid of men like Ethan or Lucas walking away. I was afraid of being seen fully and then deemed insufficient. Performance protects against that outcome. If I am always impressive, then any rejection can be attributed to incompatibility. But if I am simply myself and someone leaves, the rejection feels personal, final. That is why the fear beneath the performance is so persistent. It is not about applause. It is about survival. But here is the truth I have had to sit with, slowly and without drama. No one can stay with a version of me that isn't real, and no one can leave the parts of me I never allow them to see. The question then is not whether I am impressive enough. It is whether I am willing to be known. Because if I am known and someone stays, that is different from being admired and selected. And if I am known and someone leaves, that is information, not condemnation. That shift is subtle, but it changes everything. Underneath the performance, underneath the competence and the strength, there is a woman who is sometimes unsure, sometimes tired, sometimes ordinary. For years, I believed she had to be hidden. Well, now I see that hiding her was the loneliest strategy of all. What secure love actually feels like, and why it felt so unfamiliar to me. Secure love did not arrive in my life with fireworks. It arrived quietly, so quietly that I almost overlooked it. If I am honest, when I first began building something steady with Mark in Seattle, I kept waiting for the twist, the reveal, the hidden flaw that would justify my old vigilance. I had been conditioned to believe that intensity signaled meaning, that the emotional spike was proof of depth. But secure love does not spike, it settles. That was deeply unfamiliar to me. There is a specific sensation that used to define attraction in my body. It was sharp, immediate, slightly destabilizing, a rush of anticipation followed by uncertainty. I thought that was chemistry. I thought that was passion. With Mark, what I felt was different. It was quieter in my chest. My breathing stayed even. I did not feel compelled to check my phone every few minutes. When he said he would call, he did. When he said he cared, his behavior matched the sentence. There was no puzzle to solve. At first, that felt almost disappointing. I remember sitting across from him at a small restaurant in Capitol Hill. The lighting was soft. The conversation flowed easily. There were no games, no subtle power shifts, no calculated silences. And yet, part of me was scanning for something more. More what? More drama, more intensity, more evidence that this mattered. It took me time to understand that I had equated drama with importance. If it feels chaotic, it must be meaningful. If it feels steady, it must be ordinary. But secure love does not feel like a roller coaster. It feels like walking beside someone at the same pace. It feels like clarity. One of the first things I noticed was that I did not have to decode him. I did not need to analyze tone or timing. When he was upset about something, and he said it directly. When he needed space, he explained it without withdrawing affection. There was something profoundly adult about that. It removed the guessing game. And without the guessing game, I had no role to play. In unstable dynamics, I knew who I was. Adaptive, perceptive, impressive. In secure love, I was simply present. And presence requires a different kind of courage. It requires tolerating peace. That may sound simple, but it was not. There were evenings when Mark and I would sit in comfortable silence, reading or watching something mindless. No emotional crescendo, no tension, just shared space. My body would sometimes interpret that calm as absence. Is this it? I would think. Is this all there is? What I was actually feeling was unfamiliar safety. When you grow accustomed to emotional spikes, calm can feel flat. The nervous system, wired for activation, misses the surge. It confuses regulation with boredom. Now I had to learn to distinguish between dullness and steadiness. Dullness feels disengaged. Steadiness feels grounded. The difference is subtle, but essential. Secure love also revealed something else. It required reciprocity, not performance. With Lucas, I felt like I was constantly adjusting, presenting, managing. With Mark, there was mutual effort. He initiated plans. He asked about my day. He shared his own vulnerabilities without dramatizing them. There was no emotional withholding to earn, and there was no prize at the end of endurance. He was simply available, and availability is surprisingly intimate. Because when someone is available, you cannot hide behind pursuit. You cannot blame inconsistency for your own distance. You cannot claim you are trying if you are not fully showing up. Secure love removes the fantasy of potential and replaces it with reality. And reality can feel less intoxicating than fantasy. There is no narrative of, once he commits, everything will change. There is only what is happening now. For someone like me, who had spent years attaching meaning to anticipation, living in the present felt exposed. Another unfamiliar aspect of secure love was conflict. In unstable relationships, conflict often felt like threat, raised voices, withdrawal, or silence that lingered too long. With Mark, disagreement did not escalate into emotional disappearance. We had conversations that were uncomfortable, but contained. We disagreed about practical things, time, priorities, family boundaries. But disagreement did not translate into withdrawal of affection. That distinction changed something in me. It showed me that connection does not require perfection. It requires willingness. Secure love also felt surprisingly simple. Not simplistic, not shallow. Simple in the sense that there were no hidden agendas. If he liked me, he said so. If he was busy, he explained it. If he was hurt, he addressed it. And there was no mystique. And without mystique, I had to confront how much I once romanticized emotional distance. Distance can feel alluring because it creates longing. But longing is not the same as love. Longing is desire amplified by scarcity. Love, in its secure form, is not scarce. It is consistent. That consistency was what initially unsettled me most, because if love is consistent, then it cannot be earned through extraordinary performance. It cannot be secured by being exceptional. And it cannot be won through strategy. It either exists mutually or it does not. There is something deeply leveling about that. Secure love also asks something of me that no unstable dynamic ever did. It asked me to choose, not to wait to be chosen. To choose, to evaluate whether this man aligned with me, whether I felt respected, whether I felt free to be honest. That shift in orientation felt powerful but unfamiliar. For years, my energy was focused on how to be wanted. Now, and I had to consider whether I wanted. Secure love gave me space to observe my own reactions. Did I feel calm in his presence? Did I feel able to express dissatisfaction without fear? Did I feel my body relax when he entered the room? These questions mattered more than butterflies. And over time, I began to notice something subtle. The calm that once felt flat began to feel nourishing. The absence of drama felt like relief, not boredom. The clarity that once seemed unremarkable began to feel rare. Secure love did not ignite me. It grounded me. It did not make me question my worth every week. It made my worth irrelevant to the equation. I was not auditioning. He was not evaluating. We were participating. That is what felt so unfamiliar. Participation instead of performance. Reciprocity instead of pursuit. Presence instead of prediction. It took me years to understand that peace does not lack passion. It lacks fear. And for someone who once mistook anxiety for chemistry, can that distinction change everything? Choosing myself in real, tangible ways, not a mantra, a practice. For a long time, choosing myself sounded like something you print on a throw pillow. It sounded polished, empowered, slightly hollow. I had said versions of it before, especially after my divorce. I told friends I was focusing on myself. I told myself I was prioritizing my needs. But if I looked closely, most of my energy was still oriented outward, toward being valued, toward being needed, toward being chosen. Real self-choice did not begin as a declaration. It began as an audit. One quiet Sunday morning in Seattle, I sat at my dining table with a notebook and asked a question I had avoided for years. If no one were watching, what would I want my life to look like? Not what looks impressive, not what sounds accomplished at a dinner party, not what makes me seem stable or desirable. What would feel aligned? The question felt almost destabilizing, but I realized how much of my life had been structured around external validation, career milestones that signaled competence, social commitments that reinforced reliability. Even my relationship patterns were influenced by who choosing me would say something flattering about my worth. So I started breaking my life into categories. Not as a productivity exercise, but as a clarity exercise. Career, finances, emotional life, physical health, friendships, spiritual grounding, romantic partnership. In each area, I asked myself a difficult question. Am I living this way because it is true for me, or because it makes me look secure? In my career, I was successful by most standards. I had built credibility. I was respected. But I noticed how often I volunteered for responsibilities that drained me, because saying yes reinforced my identity as indispensable. Choosing myself did not mean quitting my job dramatically. It meant setting one boundary, leaving one meeting on time, and declining one extra project that would have impressed someone but depleted me. Small actions, quiet ones. In my finances, I saw how subtly I tied spending to image, the right neighborhood, the right vacations, the subtle signaling of success. I began asking whether my financial decisions reflected my values or my desire to appear accomplished. I adjusted, not radically, but intentionally. I invested more conservatively. I spent less to impress, and I gave myself permission to prioritize security over optics. In friendships, I noticed a pattern of over-functioning. I was the organizer, the emotional anchor, the dependable one. That role felt safe, but it also meant I rarely expressed my own needs. Choosing myself meant letting someone else plan dinner. It meant admitting when I felt lonely instead of presenting composure. Emotionally, the work was more delicate. I had built a reflex of self-containment. If something hurt, and I processed it privately. If I felt anxious, I intellectualized it. I prided myself on not being reactive, but self-containment is not the same as self-respect. So I began practicing emotional honesty in small ways. If I felt disappointed, I named it. If I needed reassurance, I asked for it without dramatizing. With Mark, this meant speaking plainly instead of performing steadiness. It meant saying, "I feel unsettled today," without cushioning it in humor. It felt awkward at first, but vulnerability does when you're used to polish. Physically, I began paying attention to my body not as an object to maintain attractiveness, but as a system to care for. I stopped exercising primarily to preserve desirability and started moving in ways that regulated my nervous system. Long walks along the waterfront, slow yoga, even sitting quietly without multitasking. The shift was subtle, but significant. My body was no longer a presentation tool. It was part of me. Spiritually, and I had drifted for years, not in a dramatic loss of faith, but in quiet neglect. I filled silence with noise, podcasts, news, distraction. Choosing myself meant reintroducing stillness, 10 minutes in the morning without input, no phone, no agenda, just space to notice what surfaced. Often what surfaced was grief. Grief for the years I spent auditioning. Grief for the energy I poured into being exceptional instead of being known. I did not rush to fix that grief. I let it exist. The most transformative part of choosing myself, though, was romantic. It was shifting from, how do I secure this, to, does this align with me? With Mark, I stopped scanning for proof that I was valuable to him and started observing whether I felt respected, calm, free. That shift reoriented my nervous system. Instead of leaning forward anxiously, I leaned back slightly. I watched. I listened. If something felt off, I addressed it without panic. If something felt good, I allowed myself to enjoy it without bracing for collapse. Choosing myself was not glamorous. It did not produce immediate fireworks. It produced repetition. Repetition of small decisions that said, my needs matter, my comfort matters, my truth matters. I began to see how attraction shifted as my internal orientation changed. The men who once felt intoxicating began to feel unstable. The qualities that once impressed me, mystery, emotional distance, unpredictability, now signaled misalignment. This was not because I had become superior or fully healed. It was because my baseline changed. When I stopped abandoning myself in small ways, I stopped being magnetized to people who would abandon me in larger ones. That realization felt less like empowerment and more like coherence. Coherence between what I said I wanted and what I actually tolerated. There were still moments of doubt, still flashes of old patterns. Conditioning does not evaporate overnight. But I no longer mistook self-sacrifice for maturity. I no longer equated overgiving with love. Choosing myself meant becoming attentive to the subtle signals in my body, the tightening in my chest when I ignored a boundary, the heaviness when I agreed to something I didn't want, the relief when I said no. These were not dramatic epiphanies. They were adjustments, and over time those adjustments accumulated. I began to trust myself in a way I hadn't before, not because I was perfect, but because I was paying attention. Choosing myself stopped being a slogan and became a practice of alignment, a practice of honesty, a practice of allowing my life to reflect my internal truth instead of my external performance. And as that practice deepened, something subtle shifted in my relationships. I no longer needed to be picked to feel stable. I was building stability from the inside. That did not make me invulnerable. It made me grounded. And grounding, I have learned, and is far more sustainable than being chosen. There was a morning in Santa Monica when something inside me finally shifted. It wasn't dramatic. No confrontation, no declaration, no life-altering event. I was walking alone along the shoreline just after sunrise. The Pacific was calm, almost glass-like, and the sky was layered in pale gray and muted gold. There were only a few people out, someone jogging, an older couple walking hand in hand, a woman sitting cross-legged in the sand with her eyes closed. I remember thinking how different this felt from the woman I had been years earlier. Not better, just quieter. For most of my life, I had positioned myself as the one waiting to be chosen. Chosen by a man like Ethan so I could feel desired. Chosen by someone like Lucas so I could feel exceptional. Chosen by someone steady like Mark so I could finally feel safe. But standing there, listening to the ocean move in its own rhythm, I realized something unsettling and freeing at the same time. I'd been waiting for someone else to decide my value, waiting to be selected, waiting for confirmation that I was enough, and that waiting had shaped my posture in relationships. It made me lean forward. It made me over-explain. It made me tolerate ambiguity longer than I should have. It made me internalize silence as commentary on my worth. But what if I was never meant to be picked? What if the entire framework was flawed? When the idea of being picked implies hierarchy, it implies competition, it implies evaluation, it turns intimacy into a marketplace. I began to see how subtly that mentality had shaped my behavior. When I was younger, it looked like comparing myself to other women. Quieter comparisons, more sophisticated perhaps, but comparisons all the same. Later it looked like measuring my desirability against aging, against career success, against how effortlessly I could appear emotionally balanced. See, even in secure love, the residue of that mindset lingered. A part of me still wanted to know where I ranked. But love is not a ranking system. It is a mutual choosing. And that distinction is everything. When I stopped asking, will he choose me? And started asking, do I choose this? Something recalibrated in my body. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't defensive. It was grounding. With Mark, that meant observing how I felt consistently, rather than obsessing over how he felt about me. Did I feel respected? Did I feel heard? Did I feel free to disagree? Did I feel calm more often than anxious? These questions returned power to where it belonged, not as dominance, but as agency. Choosing does not mean controlling the outcome. It means acknowledging that I have standards, that I have preferences, that I have emotional needs that are neither shameful nor negotiable. There was a time when someone walking away would have shattered me internally, not because I loved them deeply, but because I interpreted their departure as evidence of deficiency. Now, when someone steps back, it does not immediately collapse my sense of worth. It registers as information. We are not aligned. That does not mean I am unworthy. It means we are not meant for each other. That is a quieter kind of strength. It is not loud empowerment. It is not defiance. It is not, I don't need anyone. It is simply this, I am not auditioning anymore. When you stop auditioning, something subtle changes in your energy. You are no longer trying to persuade someone to see your value. You are evaluating whether the connection nourishes you. You are not waiting for approval. You are noticing alignment. There is a maturity in that shift that feels different from the performance of independence. It is softer, less reactive, more stable. I used to believe that if I could be exceptional enough, I would finally relax. Now I understand that relaxation comes from congruence, and not exceptionalism. Congruence between what I feel and what I express, between what I want and what I accept, between who I am privately and who I am in relationship. The morning in Santa Monica, I felt something settle into place. Not because my life was perfect, not because I had eliminated insecurity entirely, but because I was no longer structuring my identity around being selected. I do not need to be the woman who changes someone. I do not need to be the most interesting, the most composed, the most desirable in the room. I need to be honest. Honest about what feels right. Honest about what feels off. Honest about when I am shrinking. Honest about when I am expanding. When I am honest, I can choose. And choosing myself does not mean rejecting love. It means entering love as an equal participant. It means understanding that mutual commitment is not a prize, but a decision made by two people who both feel aligned. If someone cannot meet me there, I do not chase, and not because I am cold, but because I respect my own stability. The shift from being picked to choosing is not dramatic. It does not announce itself loudly. It is visible in small moments, in saying no without over-explaining, in asking for clarity without apologizing, in walking away from ambiguity without labeling myself impatient, in allowing someone to leave without interpreting it as a referendum on my worth. That shift feels less like empowerment and more like adulthood, and a steady recognition that my value is not up for negotiation. If I could summarize what changed, it would be this. I stopped asking, "Am I enough for him?" and started asking, "Is this enough for me?" That question alone rearranges the entire dynamic. It transforms waiting into evaluating. It transforms anxiety into discernment. It transforms longing into clarity. And if you are listening to this and recognizing yourself in the waiting, in the performing, in the subtle hunger to be chosen, and I want to say something gently, you're not broken. You're just in the middle. Now I'm curious about you. Here's a simple question. When someone pulls away slightly, what is your first instinct? A. I try harder, lean in, and prove my value. B. I pause, observe, and ask myself whether this dynamic works for me. Comment A or B below. I truly want to see where you are in this process. And if you feel comfortable, share your perspective. What has being chosen meant in your life? Has it brought peace, or has it kept you chasing? Your experience might help another woman reading the comments feel less alone. If this conversation resonated with you, subscribe to the channel. It helps this space continue. It allows these quieter, deeper conversations to reach women who are doing fine on the outside, but are quietly searching for something more honest underneath. I'll see you in the next one.